Red Willow Basin, Wyoming Territory. The year was 1887. The wind had teeth. It came screaming off the snow-capped shoulders of the Bighorn Mountains, funneling through the canyon, and hit the open basin with a howl. It was a predator. That wind, seeking out any gap in clothing, any poorly chinked log, any loose shingle. It carried the scent of pine resin, cold iron, and the deep, mineral smell of the high rock. A thin, granular snow, more like salt than fluff, scoured the landscape. It did not settle, it drifted, catching in the lee of the sagebrush and piling against the gray, dormant grasses that covered the valley floor. The sky was a vast, oppressive sheet of bruised gray, promising a week of misery. The sun, a weak, tarnished coin, had given up its fight hours ago. In this immense, frozen theater, one sound insisted on its own existence. Thwack! A long pause, filled only by the whine of the wind. Thwack! It was the sound of human will, small but impossibly stubborn, a hammer striking nail. The hammer belonged to Lydia March. She was cold to the bone. The cold was a physical weight, pressing against her chest, slowing her blood. She worked on the skeleton of a small cabin perched just above the banks of Dry Creek. The creek itself was a sullen brown ribbon, its edges choked with ice, the water moving sluggishly beneath a thin crust. The structure she was fighting to raise was a ruin. The original line shack, perhaps 20 years old, had been abandoned, its roof caved in by a snow load long past. One wall had splintered and collapsed entirely. Lydia was trying to raise that wall. This was not her life. 3 months ago, her hands had known only the smooth dust of chalk, the crisp paper of examination books, and the porcelain of a teacup. She had been the head schoolmistress in Laramie, respected, secure. Now, her hands were a geography of pain. The city-soft skin was gone, replaced by angry red blisters, weeping clear fluid that froze almost instantly. Where the blisters had burst, the skin was raw. Where they had healed, they formed stiff, yellow calluses that cracked open in the dry cold. She swung the heavy framing hammer, her arm aching from the unfamiliar labor. She missed the nail head, the iron glancing off the frozen pine, sending a painful vibration up her arm to her shoulder joint. She bit back a curse, the word foreign on her tongue. Lydia March, 31 years old and unmarried, was a refugee. She had been driven from Laramie not by fire or flood, but by whispers, a scandal, manufactured whole cloth by Percival Ames, the town's most powerful merchant, a man whose clumsy, possessive proposal she had politely, and then firmly, refused. His pride, wounded, had turned venomous. Whispers of impropriety, of a nervous affliction, unsuitable for teaching children, had followed. Parents pulled their students. The school board, chaired by Ames's cousin, had requested her resignation. So she had taken her small savings, every dollar she had, and bought this, a quarter section of isolation, purchased sight unseen from a land office map, Red Willow Basin. It had sounded poetic. It was brutal, but it was hers. And here, no one could whisper. The wind simply shouted. She reset the nail, took a deep, burning breath of the thin air, and raised the hammer. She would get this wall up. She would survive this winter. She would not be broken. He saw the color of her dress first, a faded blue calico against the gray-brown landscape. Garrett Holloway sat his horse, a big buckskin gelding, on the low ridge that marked the southern edge of his property, the Quarter Moon Ranch. He had been riding his fence line, a ritual that had become more about filling the empty hours than checking for breaks. The silence of his ranch house was a living thing. It had been 7 years since Sarah's laughter had filled it. 7 years since her horse had stumbled on Chalk Ridge. 7 years of eating suppers alone. The only sound the ticking of the mantel clock she had brought from Ohio. Garrett Holloway was not an unfriendly man, but he had become a solitary one. The basin suited him. He watched the figure below. A woman. He squinted, pulling his hat brim lower. Ira Bell, the postmaster, had mentioned the Snyder's old claim had sold to an L. March. He had assumed it was a man, maybe a trapper or another hopeful fool looking for silver. He watched her work for a full 10 minutes. The wind tore at her, whipping her skirts and the thin shawl she wore. She was doing it all wrong. The bracing was angled improperly. She was trying to muscle the wall section into place without leverage. It would never hold against the first real gust. She swung the hammer with desperation, not rhythm. He saw her miss the nail, saw her small frame jolt with the impact. He saw her stop, bow her head for just a second, and blow on her hands. Something in him tightened. Not pity. He had no use for pity. It was recognition. He recognized the shape of someone pushed to their absolute limit, with nowhere to go but forward. It was a foolish, dangerous place to be. Alone, with winter coming on. He nudged the buckskin, the horse carefully picking its way down the rocky incline, the crunch of its hooves on the icy gravel loud in the cold. The sound of the hammer stopped abruptly. Lydia March turned. Her body went utterly still. She did not reach for a rifle, but her left hand dropped to grip a long iron pry bar that was leaning against the half-built wall. She did not raise it, but she held it. Her posture was not fearful. It was defiant. Garrett reined in his horse a good 20 yards away, a distance that respected her space. He kept his hands, covered in thick leather work gloves, resting lightly on the saddle horn. "Ma'am." His voice was low, rough from disuse, but calm. Lydia stared at him. He was a big man, broad in the shoulders, made larger by the heavy sheepskin coat he wore. His face was weathered, browned by sun and wind, with deep lines around his eyes. He looked like he had grown out of the rock of the basin itself. She gave a short, tight nod. "Sir?" Her voice was clear, crisp, the vowels betraying an Eastern education. "That's a hard wind to be working against," Garrett said. It was not an opening for conversation. It was a statement of fact. "It is." He gestured with his chin toward the wall. "You're bracing that section against the load-bearing studs. You need to angle your brace against the prevailing wind. Anchor it to the foundation logs. The way you have it, the first big gust will fold it flat." He saw the tension in her shoulders, the stiffening of her spine. She had been warned about men in the territory. She had been warned about everything. "Mr. Holloway, Garrett Holloway, my ranch, the Quarter Moon, borders your north line." Mr. Holloway. She said the name as if testing its weight. "I appreciate the advice, but this land is mine. I paid cash for it at the land office in Cheyenne. The deed is filed and recorded." Her eyes, the color of wet slate, met his directly. "I am not trespassing, and I am not in need of assistance. I only require to be left in peace." Garrett sat the horse, the animal stamping a hoof impatiently, its breath pluming. He looked from her defiant face to her hands, still clenched on the hammer and the pry bar. He saw the ruined skin. He saw the fine tremor in her wrists, the unmistakable sign of muscle exhaustion that no amount of pride could hide. He knew that look. It was the look of someone who had nothing left to lose and was terrified of being offered help, because help always had a cost. He looked at the flimsy wall, at the pile of mismatched lumber she had scavenged. He looked at the sky, which was already beginning to spit tiny, hard flakes of snow. He thought of Sarah, who had been strong, but who had understood this land's rules. This new woman, this L. March, understood nothing, except refusal. He gave a slow nod, not of agreement, but of acknowledgement. "Peace is a fine thing, but this basin does not trade in it. It trades in preparedness." He respected the fence she had just built between them, as clear as if it were barbed wire. Without another word, he swung one leg over his saddle and dismounted. The saddle leather groaned in the cold. Lydia took an involuntary half-step back. Garrett walked to the back of his horse, unlashing a heavy coil of new hemp rope. He also pulled a canvas sack from his saddlebag. The jingle of its contents was solid and heavy. He walked 10 paces toward her, stopping well short of her personal space, and placed the items on a large, flat rock that was clear of snow. "This is extra," he said, his voice flat. He gestured to the rope, then the sack. "You have got about 5 pounds of 10-penny nails in there. You will need them for the roof planking. The rope is for securing your ridgepole. That wind." He glanced at the sky. "It is going to settle in for 3, maybe 4 days. The snow will be deep by the time it clears." Lydia stared at the supplies. It was charity. It was the last thing she wanted. It was a debt. "I cannot pay you," she said, the words sharp and tasting of ash. Garrett was already walking back to his horse. He paused, looking at her over his shoulder. "It is not a loan, ma'am. It is an investment. I run 500 head of cattle in this basin. A body found frozen come spring brings the marshal, and the marshal brings questions. Questions are a nuisance." He put his boot in the stirrup and swung up. Settling into the saddle, he looked down at her, a small, stubborn figure against the vast, dying landscape. "I will ride by after the storm. I will expect to see chimney smoke." He did not wait for a reply. He neck-reined the buckskin, and the horse moved off, climbing the ridge, merging with the gray shadows of the afternoon. In moments, he was gone. Lydia stood alone. The silence that rushed back in was profound, broken only by the creek and the wind. She stared at the rope and the sack of nails. A nuisance. The word stung, but it was also clean. It was not kindness. It was not pity. It was the cold, hard currency of the territory. She did not touch the supplies, not yet. She turned back to the wall. Her arms felt like lead, her fingers numb. But she raised the hammer. Thwack! The sun was gone. The sky was darkening from lead to charcoal. The air grew colder, heavier. The small, restless gurgle of Dry Creek seemed to grow louder, insistent. It was a sound that spoke of the future, of the high country ice pack, of the inevitable spring thaw when this frozen trickle would become a brown, churning artery. It was a sound that reminded her that the battle for this land was not just against the wind and the cold. It would be, eventually, about the water. A sudden, violent gust roared down the canyon, slamming into her. It hit her with physical force, making her stumble. It snatched at her clothing and, this time, it was successful. It ripped the wool bonnet from her head. The ties tore free. She cried out, a small, sharp sound. The bonnet, her last piece of respectability, tumbled end over end. It landed on the frozen mud bank, inches from the dark water, its ribbons flapping like a wounded bird. For a second, it teetered, threatening to be swept away by the current or the next gust of wind. Lydia scrambled down the bank, her boots slipping on the slick rocks. She snatched it up, clutching the wet wool to her chest. She climbed back to her wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She would not lose one more thing. She straightened her shoulders, put the damp bonnet back on her head, and tied the broken ribbons in a hard, tight knot under her chin. She picked up the hammer. The snow was falling thicker now, stinging her face, but she did not stop. The storm hit the basin like an avalanche of air. For 3 days, the world vanished, reduced to a screaming white void that piled snow against Lydia's patched wall. She worked inside the half-shelled cabin, the wind tearing through the gaps in the planking. She used Garrett Holloway's nails, the clean, sharp scent of new iron, a strange comfort. She worked until her hands were numb, until she could no longer feel the hammer. When she slept, huddled in her blankets, the wind's howl was the voice of Percival Ames. The memory was not cold, like the basin. It was humid, close, smelling of pipe tobacco and bay rum. Percival Ames owned the largest mercantile in Laramie. He was a man built of soft handshakes and hard ledgers, a pillar of the church, and a widower of 2 years. He had invited her to his parlor, a room suffocated by dark velvet and heavy furniture. "Miss March, Lydia," he had begun, his smile confident, his eyes assessing her not as a woman, but as an asset. "You are a woman of considerable reputation, but reputation is a fragile thing. Laramie is a civilized town, but it remains the frontier. A woman alone." He had offered marriage as one might offer a business merger. Her reputation, her role as schoolmistress, would lend his crude wealth a veneer of culture. In return, she would be protected. "I am not in need of protection, Mr. Ames," she had said, her voice quiet but clear. "I am in need of respect, which I have earned." "Respect," he had mused, swirling the brandy in his glass. "Respect is what the community grants. It is not earned, my dear. It is given, and just as easily, it is withdrawn." She had refused him, politely, then, when he pressed a moist hand to her arm, firmly. The whispers began 2 days later. They were subtle, like poison in a well. Miss March seemed strained. Miss March had a nervous disposition. Had you seen the way she looked at young Mr. Evans? Perhaps the stress of teaching was too much for a woman of her delicate constitution. Parents, one by one, began to express concerns. The school board, bowing to the quiet pressure of its wealthiest member, had accepted her resignation with a regret that felt like triumph. Lydia woke to a profound silence. The storm had broken. The basin was a blinding sheet of white, the sky in piercing, painful blue. The cold was cleaner now, sharper. She was running low on flour and salt. She had no choice but to walk the 4 miles to the small cluster of buildings known as Dry Creek Crossing. Garrett Holloway, meanwhile, had spent the storm in his ranch house. The silence of the quarter moon was an old, heavy coat he had worn for 7 years. He stoked the fire in the large stone hearth, the same hearth Sarah had loved. The house was built of solid, thick logs, but it was empty. It was full of her absence. He didn't think of the accident itself. He refused that memory. He thought, instead, of the sound her hands made on the piano keys, a lively, clumsy rhythm that always made him smile. He thought of the scent of apples and cinnamon that meant she was in the kitchen. He thought of her laughter, a bright thing that had bounced off these dark logs and made the whole house feel warm. He had been riding Chalk Ridge with her that afternoon. She had been racing him. She was always racing. He had warned her the shale was loose after the rain. She had just laughed and spurred her mare ahead. He saw the horse slip, a sickening slide of gravel. He saw her try to right the animal. Then he had closed his eyes, just for a second. When he opened them, the ridge was empty. He had buried her, and then he had buried himself. He ran the ranch with grim efficiency, but he spoke little. He avoided the town socials. He avoided kindness. Kindness was a door left ajar, inviting pain to walk back in. His comment to the March woman that a body was a nuisance had been the truth. It was a fence, built of hard words, to keep involvement out. But as he looked out over the frozen basin, he could not shake the image of her, small and defiant, swinging a hammer she could barely lift, her hands ruined. The post office at Dry Creek Crossing was also the general store, a cramped room smelling of coffee, kerosene, and oiled leather. Ira Bell, the postmaster, was a small, anxious man who seemed to live in fear of his own telegraph key. He peered at Lydia over his spectacles. "March L.," he muttered, sorting through a small pile of mail. "Yes, ma'am. I have your deed confirmation from the territorial office, right here." He handed her the envelope. "All stamped and proper." Lydia took it, her fingers stiff. "Thank you, Mr. Bell." "It's valid. All right," he continued, unable to stop his nervous chatter. "Your quarter section, right on the creek, paid in full." He lowered his voice. Leaning over the counter, Though, if you'll pardon me, ma'am, it's the creek itself that's the trouble." Lydia looked up. "Water rights," Ira whispered, polishing his glasses. "That stretch of dry creek, it's been disputed for years. The Kincaids claim upstream rights. The ranchers downstream claim historical use. It's a tangle, a real tangle, especially with the winter we're having. When that ice breaks, well, water is life out here. Miss March, more than land." A chill, colder than the wind, touched Lydia. "My deed includes riparian access." "It includes what the land office says it includes. That ain't the same as what the basin allows," he said grimly. His words were proven moments later. Two ranchers, their faces chapped red by the wind, entered the store, stamping snow from their boots. They stopped when they saw her. Their eyes took in her city-cut wool coat, now stained with mud, and her obvious status as a woman alone. One nudged the other. "That's her, the one squatting on the old Snyder place." "Ain't squatting if she paid," the other muttered, loud enough to be heard. "But it's damn foolishness. A woman alone in the high country, come winter. She'll be dead or begging by February." The first man grunted, picking up a sack of tobacco. "Just means trouble. She'll get snowed in, and decent men will have to risk their necks pulling her out. Or she'll pull some stunt, get herself hurt, just trouble." Lydia placed her coins on the counter for flour and salt. She met their gaze, her own as flat and hard as the coins. She did not speak. She gathered her small parcels, nodded once to Ira Bell, and walked back out into the blinding white. She would not be trouble. She would not be a burden. And she would not beg. She returned to the cabin with a new, cold fury. She would not just survive. She would build. She spent the next week in grueling, relentless labor. The rancher's words were a fuel. Ames's insult was a fuel. She worked from the first gray light until her hands were too frozen to grip the tools. She hauled rock from the creek bed, building a crude foundation. She learned to mix mud and straw, chinking the gaps between the logs until her arms screamed with the effort, the wall Garrett had warned her about. She tore down and rebuilt, angling the braces deep into the frozen earth. One afternoon, searching for dry wood, she followed a wisp of smoke and found the source a smithy, tucked into a fold in the hills. A woman, broad-shouldered and taller than most men, was hammering a glowing orange horseshoe. Her face was smudged with soot, and her heavy apron was charred. This was Nora Dunn, the basin's blacksmith. She paused her hammering as Lydia approached. "You're the teacher," Nora said. Her voice was a low rasp. "Saw you at the crossing. You look half frozen." "I need a stove," Lydia said, her words coming out in white puffs. "A heating stove. Something small. I can pay." Nora Dunn looked her up and down, her gaze far more assessing than the rancher's. She saw the blisters, the mud on her dress, the exhaustion, and she saw the spine holding it all up. "Got an old cast-iron potbelly," Nora said, gesturing with her hammer. "Cracked firebox, but I patched it with furnace cement. It'll leak a little smoke, but it'll hold heat. You can have it for $3. Silver." Lydia paid. Nora helped her load the heavy stove onto a rickety sledge Lydia had built. "You're a fool for being out here alone." "Teacher," Nora said, not unkindly. "But you ain't weak. Keep that fire high, and bank your coals at night." The installation of the stove was a victory. That night, for the first time, Lydia slept in warmth. 2 days later, Garrett Holloway returned. He rode up slowly, not wanting to surprise her. He saw the new chinking, the solid wall, the thin ribbon of smoke rising from a new stovepipe. He saw her trying to raise the first of the heavy roof rafters. She was failing. She had a rope slung over the top plate, trying to haul the massive log up, but she lacked the weight and the leverage. She was straining, her feet slipping in the mud, her face pale with frustration. He dismounted, the buckskin sighing in the cold. He walked over. Lydia stopped, breathing hard, her hands raw on the rope. She looked trapped, half expecting another lecture, half expecting charity. Garrett simply walked past her. He took the rope from her unresisting hands. "You'll pull your shoulder from its socket that way," he said, his voice neutral. He retied the knot, found a better angle, and gave a powerful, measured pull. The log scraped, moved, and settled partway up. "I'll take the high side. You push the low end when I give the word, on 3. She nodded, wiping her face with a muddy sleeve. 1, 2, 3. He pulled. She pushed. The log slid into place. They worked like that for the rest of the afternoon. They did not speak. There was no need. The language of shared labor took over. He, with his quiet strength and knowledge of leverage. She, with her dogged persistence, fetching the next rafter, holding the guide rope, setting the nails he had given her. He respected her rhythm. He never took a tool from her hand. He simply worked at her side, filling the gaps her strength could not. She did not offer thanks, and he did not offer advice. The silence between them was not the empty, grieving silence of his ranch house, nor the humiliated, angry silence of her past. It was a shared quiet. It was the peace of two people focused on a single, necessary task. As the last ray of sun vanished, the main frame of the roof was complete. The cabin looked like a home. Lydia moved stiffly, her body a single ache. She went inside, stoked the small stove, and boiled water in her tin pot. She brought out 2 tin cups of black coffee. It was bitter, made from cheap, over-roasted beans. She handed one to him. Her fingers, cracked and bleeding, brushed his heavy leather glove. He took the cup. They stood in the snow, drinking. The steam from the cups rose in the freezing air. He looked at her hands. He saw the price of her pride. She looked at his eyes. She saw the cost of his isolation. They were 2 solitary people, standing in the vast, indifferent twilight of the Wyoming high country. He had come to stop a nuisance. She had come to escape a scandal. But as they stood there, sharing the bitter coffee, the shared warmth of the cups in their frozen hands felt more real than any consolation, more honest than any word. In that parallel loneliness, something new and deeply dangerous to them both began to take root. The thaw, when it came, was not a gentle melt. It was a fracture. The basin, locked in silence for weeks, began to groan. Ice on the creek cracked with sounds like distant pistol shots. The sun had a new, sharp edge, and the world began to weep. Water dripping from the eaves of Lydia's finished roof and running in rivulets down the hard-packed snow. With the melt came people. The roads became passable, and the veneer of frontier civilization returned to Dry Creek Crossing. The center of this civilization was the Kincaid Mercantile, a 2-story false front building that sold everything from sow belly and bullets to lace ribbons and bottled perfumes from back east. Presiding over this domain was Maribel Kincaid. She was 25, with hair the color of new corn silk, coiled in a perfect, fashionable bun. She wore a dress of dark green wool that had come on the last train from Chicago. She was the town's princess, and for 7 years. The basin had held a quiet, collective breath, assuming she would one day marry Garrett Holloway. It was an arrangement that made perfect sense. The Kincaid money and the Quarter Moon land, it was a dynasty in the making. When Maribel saw Garrett Holloway helping Lydia March load a sack of feed into her wagon, a wagon Lydia had repaired herself with parts from Nora Dunn. Her blue eyes narrowed. She saw not a woman in need, but a complication, a piece of driftwood, uninvited, lodging itself in her creek. "Garrett, darling," she called, stepping onto the boardwalk, her voice like honeyed whiskey. "Father needs a word about the spring cattle contract." She smiled, a bright, polished smile that did not include Lydia. She did not even look at Lydia. She simply dismissed her. Lydia, feeling the sting of that calculated invisibility, nodded once to Garrett. "Thank you for the help, Mr. Holloway." She climbed onto her wagon, her movement stiff but sure, and clicked the reins. Maribel watched her go. "Such a strange creature," she murmured, linking her arm through Garrett's. "It is a scandal, really, a woman of her type, living alone out there. It gives the basin a bad name." "She is a landowner." "Maribel," Garrett said, his voice flat as he gently removed his arm. "Just like your father, just like me. Land does not make quality. Garrett, you know that." The whispers started in the mercantile and found fertile ground in the wooden pews of the town's small church. Reverend Cole, a earnest, short-sighted man, was the unwitting instrument. "We pray," he intoned on Sunday, his gaze drifting over the assembled ranchers and merchants. "For those new to our basin, we pray for those facing hardship and isolation, that they might find community, and that they might understand the responsibilities of that community." The good people of Red Willow Basin bowed their heads. They heard isolation, and it confirmed Lydia was an outcast. They heard responsibilities, and they thought of the water. The rumor, born of Maribel's displeasure and watered by the Reverend's innocence, was this: the schoolmarm was stealing water, that she had deliberately bought the old Snyder place to dam the creek and hold the ranchers hostage for the spring melt. "She's digging a diversion ditch," one rancher claimed over coffee at the store. "I heard she's building a flume," said another. "Plans to sell the water downstream to the railroad." It was nonsense. Lydia's small irrigation ditch was 100 years old, built by the first settlers, and barely pulled enough water for a kitchen garden. But fear in the dry territory was more potent than fact. Sheriff Bram Kettering understood this. He was a heavy man, kept in his office not by bravery, but by a delicate understanding of the basin's power structure. He wore his badge as a matter of negotiation, not enforcement. He rode out to the quarter moon, not to Lydia's cabin. He found Garrett mending a harness in his barn. The smell of leather and neat's foot oil filled the air. "Garrett," Kettering said, taking off his hat and wiping the sweatband. "Got a situation brewing." Garrett kept working the leather, his hands strong and steady. "Always a situation, Bram. It's this March woman. The town's concerned about the water." "She's done nothing to the water." "Does not matter," the sheriff said, shifting his weight. "It's what people think she's done. You know the rule, Garrett. When this ice goes, the man who controls the headwaters controls the grass, controls the cattle, controls every last dollar in this basin. The Kincaids are nervous. When the Kincaids get nervous, I get nervous." "What do you want from me, Bram?" "She respects you. You helped her with her roof. Talk to her. Tell her to ease back. Not look so ambitious. People are calling her a water thief. That's a dangerous name to wear out here." "She's a teacher," Garrett said, the words sharp. "She was a teacher," Kettering corrected, placing his hat back on his head. "Now, she's just a problem. And you are standing too close to it. You have got contracts with Kincaid. You are part of this town. Do not let one piece of drifted scandal sink your boat, son." Garrett watched him ride away. He was trapped. The word contracts hung in the air. His entire operation the feed for his cattle. The sale of his beef ran through the Kincaid mercantile. To stand with Lydia was to stand against the town, against his own livelihood. To stand with the town was to abandon the one person who, in the shared silence of labor, had made him feel something other than loss for the first time in 7 years. He found himself inventing reasons to ride his southern fence line, the one that bordered her property. He told himself he was checking for drift. He saw her one bright, cold afternoon. The Blue Lark School, a one-room shack not far from the crossing, was closed for the winter, its children running wild. A group of them, 4 boys and a girl, were down by Dry Creek, their laughter echoing. The creek was a patchwork of open water and treacherous, rotting ice. Lydia was chopping wood, the rhythmic thunk of her axe a testament to her new strength. She paused, wiping her brow, and her head snapped toward the creek. One of the older boys, Billy Kincaid, Maribel's younger cousin, had dared the others to run the ice bridge. He was halfway across when the surface bowed. Lydia did not shout. She dropped the axe and she ran. She moved with a speed Garrett had not known she possessed. The children, seeing her, froze. The ice cracked. She did not slow. She slid the last few feet on the muddy bank, her arm outstretched, and grabbed the back of Billy Kincaid's heavy wool coat. She hauled him backward, the force of it throwing them both to the ground, just as the sheet of ice he had been on tilted and slid into the churning brown water. The boy was pale, gasping, more from shock than cold. The other children were silent, their game instantly over. Lydia got to her knees. She was shaking, but her voice was steel. She did not coddle the boy. She grabbed his chin, forcing him to look at her. "Do you see that water?" she demanded, her voice low and fierce. "It is so cold it will stop your heart in 1 minute. Not 2, 1. You do not ever trust the ice in a thaw. You do not trust it until the oldest rancher tells you it is safe. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am," Billy whispered, his eyes wide. "Go home, all of you, now. Go!" They scattered, running as if a wolf were after them. Lydia remained on her knees for a moment, her head bowed. She had not hurt the child. She had saved him. But in that moment, she had also shown her authority. The core of the schoolmistress she still was. Garrett stayed on the ridge, his heart pounding. He had seen her save the heir to the Kincaid fortune, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that it would not matter. It might even make things worse. He was right. 2 days later, a new piece of paper was tacked to the community board in the Mercantile. It was an old land flyer, printed months ago in Cheyenne, advertising the quarter section she had bought, but across the bottom, in a crude, looping script that looked nothing like Lydia's educated hand, someone had scrawled a message. "Water rights guaranteed. Full creek access. First come, first served." It was a forgery, a clumsy, obvious lie, designed to look like a boast. It was proof. The schoolmarm was a thief. This, Garrett could not ignore. It was an escalation, a public accusation. He rode to her cabin that evening. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, and the air was heavy. She was mending a harness strap by the light of her single lamp. She looked up as he entered, her eyes questioning. He did not remove his hat. "The town is on fire," he said. No preamble. "They say you are stealing water. Now this." He threw the flyer onto her small table. She looked at it. Her face, already tired from a day's work, became utterly blank. She read the forged words, and her mouth tightened. "I did not write this," she said. "I know that, but they do not." He took a breath. "Ira Bell mentioned you came from Laramie. He said you left quickly." She looked back at the harness. "I did." "There is a name, Lydia. It is being whispered along with yours, Percival Ames." Her hands stopped moving. The needle paused in the thick leather. She sat very still, her back to him. The silence in the small cabin was absolute, broken only by the hiss of the potbelly stove. "Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You have been a neighbor to me. You helped me raise my roof. I am grateful for that." She stood and turned, the harness strap still in her hand. Her face was not angry. It was not sad. It was cold. It was the face of a woman who had drawn a line in the dirt. "Percival Ames is a man who believes he can purchase anything. He offered to purchase me. I refused. As a result, he destroyed my name, my career, and my home. I came here with what little I had left. I built this cabin with my own hands. I have not asked anyone for anything, and I will not be driven out again." She looked at him, her slate-gray eyes pinning him in place. "I left Laramie to keep what honor I had left. I will not discuss that man, or that town again, with you, or anyone else." She had answered him, and she had warned him. Before he could reply, the sound of a bell ringing came from the crossing. It was the signal for a town meeting. The spark had found its tinder. The final trigger was pulled the next evening. The mercantile was packed. Ostensibly, the meeting was about spring supply wagons, but the tension was thick. Lydia was there, standing at the back, clutching a small list. She needed seed. Maribel Kincaid stood on the low platform at the front of the store. She was luminous in the lantern light, the picture of civic-minded grace. "Friends," she began, her voice carrying easily. "We all know this basin is growing. With growth comes challenges. Challenges to our resources, to our very way of life." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room, landing for a moment on Lydia. "The simple truth is that our water is our future. We cannot allow it to be mismanaged, squandered, or hoarded by any single party." A murmur of agreement. "That is why," Maribel said, placing her hand on her father's arm. "The Kincaid Mercantile, on behalf of the established families and businesses of Red Willow Basin." She smiled, a confident, proprietary smile. "Is filing a formal petition with the Territorial Land Office. We are petitioning to assume control of the Dry Creek headwaters, to manage and distribute the water fairly, for the greater good of the entire township." The room erupted. It was a power play, plain and simple. Whoever managed the water owned the basin. Lydia stood frozen at the back, her seed list crushed in her hand. This was not about a rumor. This was about law. This was Percival Ames all over again. But this time, the weapon was not a whisper. It was a pen. Maribel looked directly at her, her smile fixed and bright. The war was no longer quiet. It had just been declared. The petition was filed. The town was a pot of water set to boil. But the basin had its own timetable. 2 nights after the meeting at the Mercantile, a warm wind blew down from the high peaks. It was a Chinook, and it carried the false, dangerous breath of spring. The temperature rose 20 degrees in less than 3 hours. The sound began just after midnight. It was not the howl of wind or the cry of a wolf. It was a deep, seismic groan that seemed to come from the bones of the earth. It was the sound of the ice pack, a foot thick, breaking apart under the pressure of the melt. Lydia awoke, sitting bolt upright in her narrow cot. The cabin shuddered. The groan was followed by a series of sharp cracks, like artillery fire, echoing down the canyon. By the first gray light of dawn, Dry Creek was unrecognizable. It was no longer a creek. It was a churning, muddy, white-flecked river. The water, thick with ice chunks the size of wagons, had surged over its banks. It tore at the willow roots and flooded the low pastures, transforming the basin into a shallow, turbulent lake. The sound was a constant, deafening roar. Lydia pulled on her boots and ran outside. Her cabin, set on slightly higher ground, was safe, but the water was only yards from her doorstep. She was securing her woodpile when she heard a new sound, thin and desperate, cutting through the roar of the water. A high, terrified bawling. She scrambled up the slick bank, her boots sinking in the mud. She squinted against the spray. In the middle of the raging current, a small, dark shape was clinging to a spinning flow of ice. It was a calf, a new spring calf, its red coat dark with freezing spray, maybe only a week old. She looked toward the quarter-moon boundary. The flood had torn out Garrett's lower fence line. She saw him then, a mile downriver. He was on his horse, fighting his way upstream along the new, unstable shoreline. His buckskin reared as the ground turned to soup beneath its hooves. He had clearly seen the same thing. "It's hung up!" he roared, his voice barely audible over the din. He was still 300 yards away. "It won't last." He was right. The ice floe, trapped in the main current, was breaking apart. The calf stumbled, its cry frantic. It was going to be swept away. Lydia did not think. She ran back to her small shed. Her eyes fell on the heavy coil of new hemp rope, the rope he had given her. She grabbed it and ran back to the bank, positioning herself directly opposite the trapped animal. "The current's too fast," Garrett yelled, closing the distance. He was off his horse now, running through the sucking mud. "I can't reach it," Lydia cried. Her hands were clumsy with cold. She fashioned a loop, a poor, heavy lariat. She swung it twice and threw it. The rope, weighted by the water, fell short, splashing into the brown torrent. The ice floe struck a submerged rock and shuddered violently. The calf fell, its legs splaying, and it barely scrambled to its feet. "Again!" Garrett bellowed. He was closer now. He did not stop at the bank but plunged straight into the flood. The icy water swirled around his knees, then his waist. He fought for purchase on the slick, unseen stones, bracing himself against the force. "Try again." Lydia hauled in the heavy, wet rope, her hands burning. She threw again, putting all her strength into it. This time, the loop sailed true. It landed perfectly over the calf's head, but it was too loose. "It's no good," she screamed in frustration. "It won't tighten." Garrett was almost chest deep, his face a mask of strain. "Pull it when I say." He took 2 more dangerous steps, grabbing a submerged willow branch with one gloved hand to anchor himself. "Now, Lydia, pull." She dug her heels into the mud, wrapping the rope around her arm, and leaned back with all her weight. The rope snapped taut. The calf, pulled off balance, slipped from the ice and vanished into the freezing water. Lydia cried out. It reappeared 5 yards downstream, sputtering, the rope now dangerously tight around its neck. "Keep the line," Garrett roared. He let go of the willow and threw himself forward, launching his body into the main current. He swam 2 powerful, desperate strokes. He grabbed the calf, his arm locking around its small, shivering body. The full force of the river seized them both, pulling them under. "Garrett!" she screamed. They reappeared, 10 yards further down. Garrett had his feet under him, but the current was trying to tear him apart. He was fighting the weight of the water, the dead weight of the calf, and the drag of Lydia's rope. Lydia scrambled along the bank, slipping, falling hard onto her knees on the wet rocks, but she never let go of the line. "To the bank!" he gasped, spitting water. "Pull me to the bank." They worked as one. She pulled, digging furrows in the mud with her boots. He kicked and shoved, shielding the calf with his own body, moving inch by agonizing inch out of the main channel. He was almost there. His boot found solid ground. He was in the shallows. With a final, desperate heave, he pushed the calf ahead of him, up onto the muddy grass. He was on his hands and knees, breathing in great, ragged sobs, water pouring from him. Lydia, seeing them safe, let the rope go slack, her own body trembling with relief. She stood up. It happened in that instant, a secondary surge, a massive wave caused by an ice dam breaking further upstream, hit the canyon. It was a wall of brown water and ice, 6 feet high, and it struck the bank with the force of a locomotive. The wave hit Lydia without warning. It tore her feet from under her. It struck Garrett, knocking him flat. Lydia cried out, a sound choked off by the water. The wave was a brutal, icy fist. It snatched her bonnet. The ties, knotted hard under her chin, snapped like thread. The heavy wool bonnet was ripped from her head. It tumbled in the frothing water, then was thrown by the wave's retreat, landing upside down, a sodden, dark shape on the wet, muddy grass of the creek bank. Lydia herself was swept, rolling toward the main channel. "Lydia!" Garrett roared. He lunged, his body moving on pure instinct. His hand, the glove torn away, closed on the fabric of her sleeve. He hauled her back, his fingers digging into her arm, dragging her from the edge just as the undertow tried to claim her. They collapsed together on the sodden bank, a tangle of limbs, mud, and freezing water. They landed hard. The calf lay 5 feet away, shivering violently, but alive. For a full minute, they did not move. They only breathed. The roar of the creek was the only sound in the world. A cold, fine sleet began to fall, mixed with the rain, stinging their faces. Lydia was coughing, spitting out muddy water. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered, an uncontrollable, rattling vibration. Garrett shifted. He moved. Not away, but closer. He rolled to his side, his big frame forming a wall, shielding her from the wind and the driving sleet. He was hovering over her, his own body shaking. His face was inches from hers. "Are you hurt?" His voice was a rasp, raw with cold and exertion. He had to shout over the river. "Lydia, are you hurt anywhere?" She tried to answer, but her jaw was locked with cold. No, I don't think..." He saw the long, bloody scratch on her cheek where a piece of driftwood had snagged her. He saw the mud in her hair, which had come undone and was plastered to her skin. He saw her eyes, wide with shock, staring up at him. The distance between them was gone. The formal fence of Mr. Holloway and Miss March, the defenses of rumor and polite society, had been washed away by the flood. There was only this, the cold, the smell of the river mud, the shared, violent proximity. His breath, coming in warm. Visible clouds, ghosted across her frozen cheek. In the landscape of ice and sleet, it was the only warm thing. "You're freezing," he whispered, the words almost lost. He raised a hand. His fingers were bare, red with cold, scraped raw on the rocks. They were trembling. He hesitated, his hand hovering near her face, the gesture impossibly gentle. Lydia did not move. She did not breathe. The world narrowed to the space of inches between their faces. Her eyes fluttered shut. It was not a decision. It was a surrender. The shaking of her body, which had been from cold, was suddenly from something else entirely, a deeper, internal tremor. That small movement was his answer. He lowered his head. This was not the clumsy, moist-palmed advance of Percival Ames. This was slow, and inevitable, and terrifying. She felt the warmth of his lips before they even touched hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was urgent. It was desperate. It was the release of every cold, lonely night, every unspoken word, every shared moment of silent labor. It was the force of the flood, concentrated into a single, devastating point. His lips were chapped and cold from the water, but impossibly warm beneath. She tasted the river, and the iron of his own will, and 7 years of crushing loneliness. Her hands, which had been lying useless in the mud, came up. She did not push him away. Her frozen fingers clenched, grabbing the thick, wet wool of his coat collar. She held on as if he were the only solid thing left on earth. He shifted, his arm moving to support her, lifting her head slightly from the mud. His other hand was still on her face, his thumb moving in a slow, possessive circle on her cheekbone. The roar of the creek faded. The sting of the sleet was gone. There was only the heat and the pressure, the astonishing, solid reality of his mouth on hers. It broke as quickly as it began. Lydia's eyes flew open. The implications of what she was doing, what they were doing, crashed over her. She was a woman of ruined reputation, in the arms of the basin's most powerful rancher, on a public creek bank. She pulled back, her hands pushing against his chest. Her breath came in a short, sharp gasp. Garrett released her instantly. He moved back, sitting up, the space between them suddenly feeling vast and electric. They stared at each other, both breathing hard. Lydia scrambled to her feet, her legs unsteady. She was covered in mud, her hair hanging in wet strands. "This," she stammered, wrapping her arms around herself, the cold rushing back in. "This was not... I did not plan for this." Garrett stood up slowly. He looked exhausted, defeated, and awakened, all at once. He ran a hand through his wet hair. "Me neither," he said, his voice rough. He looked at the churning water, then back at her.
But it's real.
The silence stretched. The calf let out a weak, pitiful cry. The sound broke the spell. "We need to get this animal warm," Garrett said, his voice returning to the practical. "Yes," Lydia said, her voice small. "My shed, the stove it's warm." Garrett moved to pick up the calf. As he did, his boot nearly stepped on something. He stooped. It was her bonnet. He picked it up. It was soaked, ruined, the muddy ribbons hanging limply. A pathetic, drowned thing. He held it out to her. Lydia looked at the object that had once defined her armor of respectability. It now looked like a joke. She took it from him. Their fingers brushed. The jolt was as strong as the kiss. A small, strange sound escaped Lydia's lips. It was almost a laugh, a choked, hysterical, quiet laugh of disbelief. Garrett watched her, and the hard line of his mouth softened. A faint smile, the first she had ever seen, touched his own lips. It was the beginning of an unspoken promise. He picked up the shivering calf, and together, in the falling sleet, they walked toward her cabin. The calf, wrapped in two of Lydia's blankets, recovered by the stove. Garrett did not stay. The reality of what had happened on the creek bank settled between them, a heavy, unspoken thing. He said he would check his fences, and he left. Lydia watched him go, her hand unconsciously touching her lips. The cold, the flood, the desperate rescue, it had all culminated in a single moment of impossible, terrifying heat. She had spent months building walls to protect her name, and in one instant, she had invited the wolf to the door. 2 days later, the wolf arrived. He did not ride in on a dusty horse. He arrived in a polished black buggy with bright yellow wheels. Pulled by a matched pair of gray geldings, he stepped onto the muddy boardwalk of Dry Creek Crossing as if stepping into a Chicago bank. He wore a tailored wool suit, a silk cravat, and a bowler hat. He smelled of bay rum and money. Lydia was at the mercantile, negotiating for seed on credit, when she heard the voice.
"A fascinatingly rustic enterprise,"
the voice said, smooth and resonant, carrying an Eastern Polish that cut through the low murmur of the store. Lydia froze. Her blood, which had been warmed by the rescue, turned to ice. She did not need to turn around. She knew that voice. She knew that smell. Percival Ames. He saw her. His eyes, the color of cold oysters, swept over her. He took in her rough-spun dress, the mud on her boots, the calluses on her hands. His gaze was not one of surprise. It was one of appraisal, as if checking the condition of a lost piece of a livestock. Maribel Kincaid was at his side, her hand tucked into his arm. She was radiant.
"Mr. Ames,"
she said, her voice bright.
"I am so glad you find our little town adequate. Father, Mr.
Ames is here." Percival Ames smiled, a thin, controlled expression. "Miss Kincaid, adequate is a word for accountants. Potent is the word I would use. This basin is raw, unbridled potential." He turned his smile toward her father. "And we are here, sir, to ensure that potential is properly managed." He held up a leather portfolio. "I have, as promised, secured the documentation from the territorial office, a finalized certificate of water rights." He was here for the water, the rumors, the whispers. Her refusal in Laramie, it had all led him here. He had not just driven her out. He had followed her, intending to take the very ground she stood on. News of the Eastern gentleman and his ironclad certificate spread faster than the flood. The Kincaid petition was no longer a request. It was, apparently, a fact. That evening, Lydia went to the only person she could think of. Ada Whitcomb kept an office in a converted tack room behind the saloon. Ada was a woman of 40, unmarried, who wore spectacles and spoke in short, precise sentences. She was the only independent lawyer within 100 miles. Lydia laid her deed on the scarred desk. "He is here. Miss Whitcomb." The man from Laramie, and he has a paper he says overrides this. Ada studied Lydia's deed. Your deed is sound. Riparian rights. Filed and stamped October 19th, 1886. Standard. She took a copy of the Kincaid certificate, which Ira Bell, vibrating with self-importance, had already posted at the post office. Ada was silent for a long time. The only sound was the hiss of her lamp and the faint tink-tink of the saloon piano next door. "This is good," Ada said, her voice flat. "Very good." "Good." Lydia felt ill. "The forgery," Ada clarified, tapping the paper. "It's excellent work, but not perfect." She held the paper to the light. "Do you see this section 4? Range 22, the coordinate for the headwaters?" Lydia looked. It was just a number. "The paper here," Ada said, "is thinner. The ink bleeds. Someone has taken a very sharp knife, probably a surgeon's scalpel, and scraped the parchment. They have lifted the original ink, right here." She pointed. "This 8. It's too heavy. The lines are not fluid. I would wager my license. Miss March, this was a 6. They have altered the coordinate, moving the boundary of the Kincaid claim 2 full sections west to include the headwaters and your entire property." "Can you prove it?" "Not here, not without the original ledger from Cheyenne. But it is a flaw, a crack in the armor." Ada looked at her over her spectacles. "This Mr. Ames is not a frontier bully. He is a predator who uses law as his weapon. He will move fast." He already had. The next morning, Maribel Kincaid found Garrett as he was loading his wagon. Her smile was gone, replaced by a look of sharp, brittle efficiency. "Garrett," she said, her voice low and tight. "We need to talk, as business partners." He paused, a feed sack in his hands. Mr. Ames is my father's new partner," she said. "He is investing a great deal of capital into the basin, starting with the water management, the contracts for the quarter moon, the winter feed, the beef buy. They are all up for review." "Maribel, what is this?" "It is this," she said, her blue eyes hard as glass. "The town needs stability. It does not need a distraction. It does not need you playing hero in the mud with that woman." The word dripped with contempt. "Her name is toxic. Garrett. Percival Ames has confirmed the stories from Laramie. She is a disgraced woman who fled a scandal, and you are associating the quarter moon name with her." She stepped closer. "You have to choose. You cannot have the Kincaid contracts in the company of Lydia March. The town must see where you stand. Keep the peace, Garrett, for your own good." He said nothing. He stared at her, seeing for the first time the cold, hard ambition beneath the corn silk hair. She was her father's daughter, and she was Ames's partner. He finished his loading and drove, not to his ranch, but to Lydia's cabin. The tension was so thick he could barely breathe. The memory of the kiss, of her hands in his coat, was a live thing between them. It made her next words even harder. He told her what Maribel had said. He did not soften it. The contracts, the choice. Lydia turned away from him, staring at the small fire in her stove. The calf, now strong, slept in a bed of hay in the corner. She was silent for a full minute. When she turned back, her face was calm, her voice measured. "You must protect your ranch, Garrett. It was your wife's home. It is your life. I came here to be free of a man like Ames, not to be the anchor that drags another good man down." "Lydia." "No," she said, holding up a hand. "He will use you to destroy me, and then he will destroy you anyway. You must stay away from me. Publicly. Do not ride here. Do not speak to me at the crossing. Tell Maribel you have made your choice. It is the only way." He looked at her, at the strength in her slate-gray eyes. She was offering him an escape. She was offering to face Percival Ames alone, just as she had in Laramie. He felt a savage, tearing rage build in his chest. He was trapped by his own contracts, trapped by the town's expectations, trapped by her damned, impossible honor. He turned, his jaw tight, his eyes full of a storm she could not read. He walked out of the cabin, leaving her standing alone, the silence of his departure more agonizing than any argument. Percival Ames did not wait for Garrett's decision. He acted that afternoon. He met with Sheriff Bram Kettering in the back room of the saloon. Ames poured 2 glasses of expensive whiskey. "Sheriff," Ames said, his voice a buttery purr, "the territorial certificate I hold empowers the Kincaid Mercantile to protect its water rights immediately. The spring melt is precious. We cannot have it leaking." "Now, Mr. Ames," Bram blustered, wiping his mustache, "I've seen the woman's deed. It's valid. This is a civil dispute. It needs a judge from Cheyenne." Ames smiled. He pushed a heavy linen envelope across the table. It was not sealed. The edges of new greenbacks were visible. "This is not a dispute, Sheriff. It is an enforcement action. The Kincaid petition, supported by my certificate, is the prevailing document. We simply need to dig a temporary diversion channel to the main Kincaid intake. A public work, for the good of the town." Bram looked at the envelope. It was more money than he made in 2 years. "I understand," Ames continued, "that your office is underfunded. Consider this a donation to the town's operational expenses, $500, to ensure the work is not interrupted." Bram's hand slid out and covered the envelope. "Public work. Yes, I see. For the good of the town. I can spare 2 deputies tomorrow." While Ames was buying the law, Nora Dunn was cursing the freight company. A massive crate, marked Kincaid Mercantile, office supplies, had been dropped on her loading dock by mistake. The wagon driver too lazy to haul it the extra 50 yards? It weighed a ton. "Damn Kincaid and his fancy Eastern junk," she muttered, grabbing her pry bar. She was trying to shift it when the poorly nailed lid splintered. A heavy, velvet-lined box slid out and cracked open on the hard-packed dirt floor. Nora stared. It was not full of ledgers. It was full of precision tools and 2 heavy, polished brass objects. She picked one up. It was a seal, a perfect, brand-new replica of the Territorial Land Office stamp. The other was the official seal of the Laramie County Clerk. She looked at the broken crate, at the seals in her soot-covered hand. She thought of the ironclad certificate everyone was talking about. "Well, I will be damned," she whispered. The next morning, Lydia watched as 2 of Bram's deputies, shamefaced but resolute, arrived with shovels. They began digging a deep trench, not 10 yards from her cabin, designed to cut off the bend in the creek that fed her small intake ditch. She stood on her porch, helpless. The law, bought and paid for, was stealing her water. She saw a rider on the ridge. Garrett. He sat his buckskin, watching the scene. He was too far away to see her expression. He watched for 10 minutes. Lydia's heart sank. He was obeying her. He was staying away. He had made his choice. Then he moved. He did not ride away. He rode, not toward her, but toward the deputies. He dismounted, his movements calm, deliberate. "Morning, boys," he said. Garrett, one of the deputies, a young man named Pike, would not meet his eyes. "Sheriff's orders. We're diverting the Kincaid water." Garrett looked at the new ditch. He looked at the water level in Lydia's intake, which was already beginning to drop. He looked at the sky, which promised a long, dry summer. Then he turned and walked to his ranch foreman, Tobin Sutter, who had ridden up with him. "Tobin," Garrett said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly on the morning air. "Ride to the south pasture. Move all 500 head of the quarter moon herd. Bring them to this side of the basin." Tobin stared, confused. "Boss, there ain't no water here. Not for that many." "There is," Garrett said. He pointed, not at Lydia's intake, but at a spot 50 yards downstream from it. "We'll cut our own intake, right here, from this same bend." Pike the deputy dropped his shovel. "Garrett, you can't! This is the Kincaid claim!" Garrett Holloway turned. He was not the quiet, grieving widower. He was the biggest landowner in the basin, and his eyes were cold steel. "This water," he said, gesturing to the creek, "belongs to this land. My land borders hers. My riparian rights are as old as Kincaid's." He walked over to Lydia, who was standing by her porch, her hands clenched. He stood beside her, facing the deputies. "If they block her water," Garrett announced, his voice a low, clear declaration that echoed in the basin. "They block mine. Tell the sheriff. Tell Kincaid. Tell Mr. Ames. The Quarter Moon Ranch stands with Miss March." Lydia looked up at him, her heart hammering so hard she thought it would break. He had not just chosen her. He had declared war. That night, the basin was still. The moon was a sliver, casting long, deep shadows. The deputies were gone, their work unfinished, confused by Garrett's challenge. But the work did not stop. In the darkness, by the gurgling creek, a shadow moved. It was not Garrett. It was not Lydia. It was a man, hired by Percival Ames, carrying a wooden boundary stake and a heavy mallet. He found the marker for Lydia's property. He looked around in the dark. Then, with quiet, measured blows, he pulled it from the soft earth and hammered it back in, 10 feet deeper onto her land. A quiet thud, thud, thud in the darkness. The sound of a map being rewritten, the sound of the trap being set. The declaration of war hung in the basin's air, thick and metallic as gun smoke. Garrett's public defiance had bought a temporary stalemate. The deputies had retreated, their shovels left sticking in the raw earth of the new ditch, and a fragile, tense quiet settled over Dry Creek. Lydia spent the next 2 days in a state of suspended animation. She worked, but her mind was elsewhere. She was waiting. The memory of Garrett standing beside her, his voice clear and strong. "The Quarter Moon Ranch stands with Miss March," was a shield. The memory of his kiss on the flood-soaked bank was a fire. She did not know which one warmed her more, or which one was more dangerous. On the third night, she sat late, mending the harness strap she'd been holding when Garrett had confronted her about Laramie. The calf, now named Creek, was asleep in its bed of straw. The pot-belly stove was banked low, its gentle heat a soft counterpoint to the rising wind outside. She felt, for the first time, a flicker of something that was not just survival. It was hope. The smell hit her first. It was not the clean scent of her own pine smoke. This was acrid, oily, kerosene. She stood, her heart stopping. A low, hungry whoosh vibrated through the floor of the cabin. She ran to the small window. The night was gone, replaced by a terrible, flickering orange. Her shed, the small, sturdy shed she had built with Nora Dunn's salvaged lumber, was a tower of flame. The hay she had spent her last dollars on, the feed for the calf, her tools, all of it was being eaten by a roaring, spitting fire. She threw open her cabin door. The heat hit her like a physical blow, 20 yards away. The roar was deafening. Her first thought was not of the hay. It was of the full can of kerosene she kept inside the shed, and the sack of lye she used for making soap. "No," she whispered. She grabbed her heavy work gloves. She did not scream. She did not panic. She ran, not toward the fire, but to the side. Her eyes squinted against the blinding light and stinging smoke. The shed was a lost cause, a cube of fire, but the kerosene, if that went, it would explode. It could throw burning debris onto her cabin roof. She saw it, the metal can, just inside the wide-open door, its painted red surface gleaming with reflected fire. The heat was unbearable, blistering the skin on her face. She held her breath, lunged forward, and hooked the can's heavy wire handle with the end of a long-handled shovel. She dragged it out, pulling it backward, scraping it over the dirt, sparks from the shed landing on her dress. She got it 20 feet away, then 30, safe. She turned. The lie. She ran back, her lungs burning. She grabbed the heavy sledge she had repaired, another tool, pulling it clear. She dragged her toolbox, the wood already hot to the touch, away from the collapsing inferno. She worked with a grim, focused fury. She could not save what was burning, but she would save what had not yet been touched. The roof of the shed collapsed inward in a massive shower of red-gold sparks, a geyser of flame shooting into the dark sky. It was done. She backed away, her chest heaving, sweat and soot running in black streaks down her face. She stood, shaking, and watched her investment, her security, her hard-won progress, turn to black ash and smoke. This was not a rumor. This was not a forged flyer. This was an answer. This was Percival Ames's answer to Garrett's defiance. She stood there until the sky began to turn from black to a sick, bruised purple. The fire died down, leaving a smoking, stinking pile of black timbers and gray ash. The shed was gone. Her hay was gone. She did not cry. The cold, clear rage that had filled her when she faced Ames in Laramie returned. But this time it was different. It was not the anger of a victim. It was the anger of a survivor. As the first weak light of dawn touched the basin, she walked into the steaming ruins. Her boots sank into the hot ash. She was looking for anything salvageable, a hammerhead, a chisel. Her boot kicked something that was not wood. It was pasteboard. She bent down, wincing as the heat came through her glove. She pulled it out. It was a fragment, charred around the edges, a piece of a shipping label. It was thick, expensive stock, not the kind of paper found in the basin. Most of the writing was gone, but 3 words, printed in crisp black ink, remained. Kincaid Merck. And below it, part of a stamp from a freight office, not Cheyenne, Laramie. She closed her fist around the hot, sharp-edged proof. A horse's hooves, coming at a hard gallop. She looked up. Garrett. He must have seen the smoke plume from his ranch at first light. He rode his buckskin right to the edge of the ruin, his face a thundercloud. He swung down before the horse even stopped, his eyes taking in the smoldering pile. Then her. He saw her face, streaked with soot. He saw her dress, scorched at the hem. He saw the cold, final fury in her eyes, and he saw the burned fragment in her hand. Ames. He said the name was a curse. He sent his regards, Lydia said, her voice a dry rasp. She held up the piece of cardboard. Garrett's face, which had been a mask of rage, became something else, a quiet, terrifying resolve. He looked from the ruin to her small, solitary cabin. He looked at the vast, empty basin around them. "You're not staying here," he said. It was not a question. "Not one more night. He's done playing with paper." "This is my home, Garrett. I will not be—" "He just tried to burn you out," Garrett said, his voice low and dangerous, cutting her off. "He did not know if you were in that shed. He did not care. You are not safe here. Go inside. Pack a bag. You are coming to the quarter moon." "And what will Maribel say to that?" Lydia asked, the words bitter. "I do not give a damn what Maribel says," he snapped. "Or her father, or Ames. This is done. Pack your bag. I am not asking—" She looked at him, at the absolute, unshakable certainty in his eyes. The barrier of his grief and her scandal was gone, burned to the ground with her shed. She nodded once, turned, and walked into her cabin. The Quarter Moon ranch house was silent. It was a fortress of thick logs and heavy furniture, a place built for a family and lived in by a ghost. It smelled of old leather, wood smoke, and Sarah's lingering absence. Garrett led Lydia into the kitchen. It was the heart of the house, dominated by a massive black iron range that radiated a deep, steady warmth. A long pine table, scrubbed white from years of use, ran down the center. He took her small, soot-stained carpet bag and set it on the floor. She stood awkwardly in the center of the room, a smudge on the clean, quiet order of his life. She was shaking. The adrenaline had fled. leaving a cold that had nothing to do with the morning air. It was the deep, rattling chill of shock and exhaustion. He unpinned his heavy sheepskin coat, the one he had worn for 7 winters, and hung it on a wooden peg by the door. Then, he gently took her own coat, which was damp and smelled of smoke, and hung it on the peg right next to his. The 2 coats, his massive and worn, hers smaller and singed, hung side by side, an intimacy more profound than a touch. Lydia stared at them. "Sit," Garrett said, his voice softer now. He pulled out a chair at the table. He moved to the stove, poured a thick white mug full of coffee, and set it in front of her. Her hands were shaking so badly she could not lift the cup. She wrapped her fingers around it, trying to absorb the heat. Garrett watched her. He saw the tremor in her hands, the way she stared at nothing, her eyes still seeing the flames. He turned, walked to a large cedar chest in the corner, and opened it. He pulled out a thick, heavy wool blanket, woven in a deep blue and green pattern, Sarah's favorite. He walked back to Lydia. She looked up, her eyes wide and lost in the unfamiliar, safe room. He did not speak. He unfolded the blanket and draped it over her shoulders. His hands, large and rough from work, brushed her neck and her arms. The touch was impossibly light, a mere whisper of contact, but it was electric. His hands lingered for a fraction of a second, his fingers pressing the warm wool against her skin. It was not a gesture of pity. It was a promise, a claim. Lydia closed her eyes, her whole body bowing under the weight of the blanket and the silent, solid comfort of his presence. She leaned her head forward, inhaling the scent of the wool, clean and faintly of cedar. When she looked up, he was still standing over her, watching her, his face grim in the firelight from the stove.
"I will not leave Red Willow,"
she said. Her voice was a hoarse whisper.
"He thinks this will make me run, like I ran from Laramie."
She shook her head, pulling the blanket tighter.
"I am not running. Not again."
Garrett nodded. A slow, single movement. The decision he had made at the creek, to stand with her, was now sealed in ash.
"Good,"
he said, his voice a low rumble.
"Then we fight, but we fight with the truth."
He moved to the door that led to the bunkhouse. "Tobin!" he yelled. His foreman appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, his eyes wide at the sight of Miss March, covered in soot, sitting at the boss's kitchen table. "Tobin," Garrett said, his voice all business. "I want you to ride to the crossing. Now, send a telegram to Cheyenne. I want you to find a man named Elijah Pike. He is a private investigator, works out of the Interocean Hotel. Tell him Garrett Holloway of the Quarter Moon Ranch has a case for him. Tell him it involves land fraud, conspiracy, and arson. Tell him his full fee will be paid, plus a bonus, if he leaves today." Tobin's eyes lit with a grim understanding. This was a fight. "Yes, sir. On my way, boss." He vanished. Garrett closed the heavy door. The wind, which had been rising all night, howled, shrieking through the small gap under the door frame before it was sealed. The sound was high and sharp, like a distant train whistle, a signal of something new coming. The counterattack had begun. Lydia clutched the warm mug, wrapped in his dead wife's blanket, and watched the man who had just staked his entire future on her word. Elijah Pike arrived on the afternoon stage from Cheyenne 2 days later. He was not what Lydia had expected. He was not a broad-shouldered gunman or a grizzled tracker. He was a small, neat man in a gray, dusty suit, with a precise haircut and eyes so quiet they seemed to absorb the light in the room. He looked more like a clerk than a rescuer, and he carried his equipment in 2 heavy, reinforced cases, one a valise, the other a polished mahogany box. He met them in Ada Whitcomb's tiny office, the air thick with the smell of old paper and the saloon's stale beer next door. Garrett, Lydia, and Ada formed a tight, anxious triangle. Pike set his mahogany box on the desk. He did not waste time on pleasantries. "Mr. Holloway," he said, his voice as dry as the dust on his suit. Your telegram was specific. Arson, fraud, conspiracy. Arson is loud, fraud is quiet. Both are acts of profound arrogance. He looked at Lydia. Which means the arsonist left a trail, and the fraudster made a mistake.
We believe we have the mistake,
Ada said, sliding the Kincaid water certificate, still tacked to the post office board, onto her desk. Pike produced a pair of spectacles and a large magnifying glass. He studied the document, not for seconds, but for a full 5 minutes. He hummed, a low, tuneless sound. The number? Ada prompted.
The 8. I believe it was a 6.
It was, Pike said, as if stating the weather. You can see the memory of the original curve. Right here, the scraper missed the downstroke. He opened his box. It was not a weapon. It was a camera. A heavy, brass-lensed box camera. We will photograph this, but first... He took out a sheet of paper, thinner than onion skin, and a stick of soft graphite. He laid the paper over the altered number and rubbed the graphite gently over the top. An image of the number appeared, the lines thick and blurred where the new ink had been applied. But the faint, scraped indentation of the original 6 was visible beneath it, a ghost in the machine.
He pressed too hard,
Pike murmured, satisfied.
Arrogance. Now, the arson.
He spent an hour at the ruin of Lydia's shed. He walked the perimeter, sketching a map. He sifted the ash with his bare fingers. He photographed the ground, the remaining timbers, and the fragment of the Kincaid shipping label that Lydia had saved. He worked in total silence. With Pike's arrival, the counteroffensive began in earnest. The kitchen at the Quarter Moon became a war room. Ada Whitcomb became the general.
He has 2 fronts,
Ada explained, her spectacles reflecting the light from Garrett's lantern.
The legal front, the certificate, and the social front, the rumors. We have to dismantle both.
Ada's first move was on Ira Bell. She and Pike visited the post office. Ira, seeing the cold-eyed man from Cheyenne, began to sweat.
Ira,
Ada said, her voice sharp.
This is Mr. Pike. He is a private investigator working on retainer for Mr. Holloway. He is investigating postal fraud and arson.
Ira turned the color of damp flour. We need your incoming freight ledger, Pike said, his voice flat.
For the last 6 months, specifically,
shipments from Laramie addressed to Percival Ames or the Kincaid Mercantile.
I can't,
Ira stammered.
Mr. Kincaid,
that's private. A federal investigation of postal fraud supersedes Mr. Kincaid's privacy. Pike lied smoothly. Unless you wish to be named as an accessory... Ira nearly fell off his stool. He produced the ledger. It took Pike less than a minute. His finger ran down the page and stopped.
Here, 3 weeks ago,
a crate, shipped from the Laramie Freight Office. Consignee P. Ames, care of Kincaid Mercantile. Contents listed, office replacements, seals and stationery.
Ada looked at Pike. Seals,
she whispered. The next piece of the puzzle was Nora Dunn. They found her at her forge, the massive bellows breathing a red glow onto her face. She looked at the graphite rubbing Pike showed her.
So he faked the stamp, too,
Nora grunted.
Not just the number.
He had a fake seal sent from Laramie, Ada said. The one you found in the broken crate. But to prove it's a fake, we need a real one. We need to compare it to a verified stamp from the same era.
Garrett,
Ada said, turning to him. Your father's original deed, the one from 1875. It would have the old territorial seal. An hour later, Nora Dunn held Garrett's father's deed in her soot-stained hand, studying the faint, embossed circle of the official seal.
Ink lies,
Nora said, echoing Ada's sentiment.
But steel doesn't. This was pressed hard. The impression is deep.
She looked at Ada, a fierce, protective light in her eyes. You want me to prove his seal is a fake? I want you to make the truth visible, Nora, Ada said. Nora Dunn, blacksmith and artist, went to work. This was not a job for the heavy hammer and anvil. This was a job for fine files, for calipers, for a jeweler's eye. She took a block of soft steel and, working from the faint impression on the old deed, she began to carve. She was not forging a fake. She was meticulously recreating the original, authentic die. It was the art of the smith turned against the art of the con man. While the specialists hunted the paper trail, Garrett and Lydia built the foundation of their case from the earth itself. Garrett, the rancher, began a new logbook. He was no longer just a man watching his boundaries. He was a scientist. Every hour, on the hour, he rode to the creek. He hammered a stake into the bank and marked it with inches. He recorded the water level, the time, the clarity. His logbook became a meticulous, damning record of a creek's life and a testament to the fact that the Kincaid diversion, even half dug, was already dropping the water level below what his cattle, and Lydia, needed to survive. Lydia, the teacher, became a historian. She borrowed one of Garrett's horses and rode out, not to town, but to the high, lonely cabins of the basin's oldest residents. She visited old Jeb Slocum, a man half mad from loneliness, who had been trapping in the basin since before it was a territory. She talked to the widow Harris, who remembered when the Kincaids had first arrived. She did not ask about the fraud. She asked about the water. "Old man Snyder," Slocum cackled. "He cut that first ditch in '71, used it for his corn. Kincaid tried to buy him out, but Snyder held on." "The Blue Lark School," Widow Harris recalled. "We all built it, put it right by the creek bend so the children would have water to drink." Lydia returned to the quarter moon, her saddlebags full of stories. She sat at Garrett's kitchen table, the table where his wife had planned her meals, and she began to draw. She took the stories, the dates, the remembered landmarks, and she translated them into a map. It was a map of memory, a map of historical use. It showed the Snyder Ditch, the school's water access, the old community irrigation lines, all in place years, sometimes decades, before the Kincaids had ever thought to claim them. Their next stop was the church. Reverend Cole was polishing the pulpit when they entered. He looked trapped. "Reverend," Lydia began, her voice firm but not unkind. "Miss March, Mr. Holloway, a terrible tragedy. That fire, a terrible, terrible thing." "It was arson, Reverend," Garrett said flatly. Cole paled. "Surely not in our community." "We are here about the water," Lydia said, cutting him off. "Do you remember, last fall, before I bought the Snyder place? I spoke with you after services. I believe I recall. I asked you specifically if the land would be suitable for a small garden for the Blue Lark School, which I had hoped to reopen, and I asked if the creek access was sound." Cole fidgeted. "I am a minister, Miss March, not a land agent." "You are a moral witness," Lydia said, her voice dropping. "You told me, 'Yes, child, the Lord provides. That creek has watered that land for 30 years. Do you remember saying that?" He looked from Lydia's intense, unblinking gaze to Garrett's cold, silent stare. He was a weak man, but not a dishonest one. "Yes," he whispered. "I remember. It was true." "Ada Whitcomb has prepared an affidavit that says exactly that," Garrett said, producing the paper. "Your sworn statement, as a man of God, that Lydia March had established her intent to use that water for the school for the community before this entire affair began." Reverend Cole looked at the paper. He looked at the door. He picked up the pen and signed. Elijah Pike returned to the ranch that night. He was, for the first time, visibly pleased. He placed a single, crumpled piece of paper on the table. "Sheriff Bram Kettering," Pike said, "is a creature of habit. He drinks at the saloon at 9. He is not a tidy man." Garrett unfolded the paper. It was a receipt from the Kincaid Mercantile, issued 6 days ago. the day Ames's deputies had started digging. "It's an invoice," Garrett said, confused. "Marked credit to account for return of 10 empty powder kegs." "An interesting transaction," Pike said, his quiet eyes shining. "I asked at the feed store. Sheriff Kettering has not bought powder by the keg in 5 years. He buys cartridges, like every other modern man." Lydia looked at Ada. Ada looked at Garrett. 10 kegs, Garrett said, his voice low as the pieces clicked into place. "What's the going rate for a keg of black powder?" "About $50, Ada said, her voice tight. Lydia did the math. 10 kegs, $50 each, $500. "The exact amount," Pike confirmed. "That Mr. Ames offered the sheriff in the saloon. I had a listen. It was a bribe, coded as a return. And here is the receipt, the proof of payment." They had it. They had all of it. The forged number, the illegal seals, the fraudulent shipping ledger, the historical map, the water logs, the moral witness, and the bribe. Ada Whitcomb stacked the evidence on the table. The kitchen was silent. "So," Garrett said, "we take this to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne." "No," Ada said. "That will take a month. By then, the water will be gone, and Lydia will be ruined. Ames and Kincaid are arrogant. They believe they have won. They have called a town hall meeting for tomorrow night to present the final Kincaid water management plan and have it ratified by the town. We do not go to the law," Pike said. "We go to the people. We present this, all of it, at their meeting. We do not give them time to run." It was a legal ambush, a public execution. The group dispersed, each to their own task. Ada to organize the testimony, Pike to clean his photographic plates, Garrett to check his revolver. Lydia remained at the kitchen table. The proof was all there. They could win the case, the water, the land. It could be saved. But the fight, she realized, was not just about the water. It was about her. The whispers from Laramie. Disgraced woman. Scandal. Percival Ames had built his case on the lie that she was a woman of no honor. She pulled a clean sheet of Garrett's ledger paper toward her and picked up a pen. The others were fighting for the land. She had to fight for her name. She dipped the pen in the inkwell. Her hand was no longer the trembling, blistered hand of the woman who had arrived months ago. It was steady, strong. "My name is Lydia March," she wrote. "I am a teacher, and I came to Red Willow Basin not as a refugee, but as a free woman." She was not just writing an affidavit. She was writing her Declaration of Independence. The Kincaid Mercantile was not built for justice. It was built for commerce. But on that night, it became a courtroom, a church, and a crucible, all in one. The room was packed so tightly that men's shoulders pressed together. A sea of wet wool and simmering resentment. The air was hot, thick with the smell of kerosene from the high-hung lanterns, cheap tobacco, and the damp, earthy scent of the thaw. Every rancher who relied on the creek, every merchant who relied on the ranchers, was there. Their faces, lit from above, were hard and anxious. They had come to protect their water, and in their minds, Lydia March was the serpent in the garden. At the front, on a low platform, usually reserved for displaying new saddles and sacks of flour, sat the new royalty, Mr. Kincaid, his face flushed and confident. Maribel, beside him, luminous in a gown of dark blue velvet that seemed to drink the light, and Percival Ames, the architect, leaning casually on a silver-headed cane, his expression one of bored, Eastern superiority. Standing at the foot of the platform, his hand resting on his pistol, was Sheriff Bram Kettering. He was not a guard, he was a gate. The meeting began. Maribel spoke first, her voice a clear, cultivated bell. She spoke of progress, of order, of the unfortunate necessities of a growing community. She framed the Kincaid petition not as a land grab, but as a civic sacrifice. They were taking on the burden of managing the water for the greater good. Then she introduced Percival Ames. He stepped forward, his polished boots immaculate. He held up the framed, official-looking certificate, the seal gleaming. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice condescendingly smooth. "This is not a debate. This is a finality. The Territorial Office, in its wisdom, has affirmed the Kincaid claim. This document is the law." He smiled, a thin, reptilian expression. "Work on the public diversion channel will resume at dawn. Under the protection of Sheriff Kettering, we are simply here tonight to accept your gratitude and ratify the plan." He was met with a low, rumbling murmur of assent. This was law. This was paper. This was final. "Before you ratify that fraud," a voice said, cutting through the heavy air. The room went silent. Every head turned. Ada Whitcomb pushed through the crowd, followed by a small, grim procession. Lydia Garrett, Elijah Pike, and Ira Bell. Nora Dunn brought up the rear, her arms crossed. Percival Ames's smile faltered. "I beg your pardon, Miss Whitcomb. You are out of order. I am an officer of the court, Mr. Ames, and you are a perjurer." Ada did not shout. She stated she tacked a large, crude map to one of the main support beams. "This meeting is now a public hearing." Ames laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "A hearing on what grounds? A disgraced schoolteacher's fantasy. On the grounds of this..." Ada held up the graphite rubbing. She tacked it beside the map. "This is the coordinate on your certificate. Section 4, range 22. The number 8. She pointed to the faint shadow, the ghost in the paper. But this document was altered. That 8 was a 6. The paper was scraped, the ink lifted. The crowd pushed forward. "What is that?" someone yelled. "It's a rubbing," Ames snapped. "A child's parlor game." "Is it?" Elijah Pike stepped forward. He held up a thick glass plate. "This is a photographic negative. Light, you see, does not lie. Where the paper was scraped, it is thinner. The light passes through. The shadow of the original 6 is visible to all." He handed the plate to the ranchers in the front row. They passed it hand to hand, their faces growing dark. "A forgery," Ames sputtered, his face reddening. This is a conspiracy." "A conspiracy? Mr. Ames?" Ada's voice was sharp as ice. "Then let us ask the postmaster." She nodded to Ira Bell. Ira, pale and trembling, stepped forward. He was holding his official ledger. "Mr. Bell," Ada commanded, "read the entry for April 12th. Ira cleared his throat. One crate, shipped from Laramie. Consignee P. Ames, care of Kincinsiad Mercantile. Contents listed: office replacements, seals and stationery." "Seals!" a voice from the crowd shouted. "He faked the damn seal!" "Precisely," Ada said. And Nora Dunn moved. She walked to the front, carrying 2 objects. She slammed them down on the counter in front of Ames, the sound a heavy, metallic judgment. "This," Nora rumbled, her voice filling the room, "is the fake seal from that crate." She held up the polished brass die. "And this," she held up the dark, hand-carved block of steel, "is a die I forged myself, a perfect copy, taken from the original territorial stamp on Jeb Holloway's deed from 1875. The crowd surged. This they understood. Not paper, not photographs, steel. "Look at them," Nora challenged, her eyes burning. "The fake one is shallow. The eagle's wing is missing a feather. His A is too sharp. Go on, check it against your own deeds. See which one is the truth." Ranchers pushed forward, pulling their own folded, worn deeds from their coat pockets. A wave of angry, betrayed shouts rose from the front. "It's a fake. She's right. He lied." The storm of public opinion had broken. Percival Ames's face was white. Maribel had risen to her feet, her hand on her father's arm. Into this sudden,
Violent silence. Lydia March stepped forward. She stood between Nora and Ada, facing the town that had whispered about her. She was no longer the soot-stained refugee from the fire. She was clean, her hair pinned back, and she was wrapped in the calm, cold armor of the truth. "My name is Lydia March," she said, her voice clear and strong. It did not shake. "I was a teacher. Mr. Ames told you I was a disgraced woman. He is right. He is the man who disgraced me in Laramie. He destroyed my name because I refused his proposal." A new, shocked silence fell. This was not about water. This was about honor. "I did not come to Red Willow Basin to hide," she continued, her gaze sweeping the faces of the ranchers. "I came to build a life. I did not come to steal your water." She pointed to the map she had drawn, the one showing the old ditches, the school's access. "I came to share the water that has fed this land for 30 years, the water that feeds your cattle, the water that belongs to the children of the Blue Lark School." She turned her gaze directly on Percival Ames, who was staring at her, his mask of civility completely gone. "I am not asking you for pity," she said, her voice rising with a strength she did not know she possessed. "I am not asking for your protection. I am asking for justice, for myself, and for the water that feeds every one of us." "This is outrageous," Ames roared, his voice cracking. He slammed his cane on the floor. This slander, that document is legal. We simply adjusted a minor clerical error for the common good." He had said it. The room went dead. Every rancher, every merchant, froze. "Adjusted." Garrett's voice was low, dangerous, from the side. "For the common good." Jeb Slocum cackled from the back. "You mean for the Kincaid good?" Sheriff Bram Kettering saw the room turning into a mob. He fumbled for his pistol. "Now, hold on," he yelled, his face slick with sweat. "This is a civil matter. Everyone just calm down. This is for a judge to decide." "I'm glad you mentioned that. Sheriff," Garrett said. He stepped forward, moving between Bram and the crowd. He was holding a single, crumpled piece of paper. He held it up, not for the crowd, but for Bram. "You look warm, Bram," Garrett said, his voice quiet, but it carried in the silence. "Must be the heat from those 10 empty powder kegs you returned to the mercantile." Bram's eyes widened. He looked from the receipt in Garrett's hand to Percival Ames. Garrett turned to the crowd. "This," he announced, "is a receipt from the Kincaid Mercantile, a credit to Sheriff Kettering's account, for the return of 10 powder kegs. An interesting transaction, especially since at $50 a keg, it comes to exactly $500. The word 5 echoed. The bribe, the coded receipt, the final nail. The room did not just murmur, it roared. It was a single unified sound of betrayal. Bribe, thief, hang him. Men surged toward the platform. "That will be enough." The voice was new. It was not loud, but it was absolute. It came from a tall, thin man in a black suit who had been standing unnoticed at the back of the room. He stepped forward, and the crowd parted for him. He had the unmistakable, cold authority of the territorial government. "My name is Judge Silas Reed," he announced, his gaze sweeping the room. "The Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne received a telegraph from Mr. Elijah Pike 2 days ago, detailing a conspiracy of fraud I was dispatched to observe." He walked to the platform. Percival Ames was ashen. Bram Kettering looked like a cornered animal. "I have observed," the judge said, his voice like chipping ice. "I have seen clear evidence of document forgery. I have seen evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud. I have heard Mr. Ames's public confession to adjusting a legal document, and I have just seen Mr. Holloway provide proof of a $500 bribe paid to a sitting sheriff." He pointed at Percival Ames. "Mr. Ames, you are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and bribery of an official." He pointed at Bram. "Sheriff Kettering,
You are relieved of your post and you are under arrest." Two men, quiet professionals who had entered with the judge, stepped forward and took Ames and Kettering by the arms. Percival shrieked, a high, undignified sound. "You cannot do this. I am—" "Kincaid, tell him." But Mr. Kincaid, his face the color of old parchment, had sat down heavily. Judge Reed looked at the Kincaid petition, still tacked to the wall. "This claim is suspended indefinitely, pending a full federal investigation." The room was silent for a beat. Then it exploded. Men were cheering, stamping their feet, whistling. They were clapping Garrett on the back. They were shaking Nora's hand. They were surrounding Ada, who was quietly packing her papers. In the chaos, Maribel Kincaid was left alone on the platform. Her entire world, her future, her power, her wealth had been dismantled in 20 minutes. She looked across the cheering crowd and her eyes met Garrett's. He was standing next to Lydia. He was not looking at Maribel. He was looking at Lydia, his face lit with a fierce, quiet pride. Maribel Kincaid, the princess of the basin, turned. Her velvet dress, the symbol of her status, brushed against the dusty wooden steps as she retreated into the shadows of the store. The sound of the town's applause, a sound that had always been for her, was now the sound of her own defeat. The town meeting shattered the basin's power structure like a pane of glass. It did not, however, quiet the town. The explosion of the trial was followed by the buzzing, frantic energy of its aftermath. Judge Reed, in his cold efficiency, had deputized Tobin Sutter and 2 other senior ranchers to hold Percival Ames and Bram Kettering in the town's own jail cell, awaiting the armed escort from Cheyenne. The Kincaids had vanished. Their store was closed, the shades drawn. Maribel, it was whispered, had taken to her bed, her nerves shattered. The ranchers, who had been a suspicious, hostile crowd, were now transformed. They tipped their hats to Lydia. They stopped by the smithy to buy Nora Dunn a drink. They clapped Garrett on the back with a force that was almost violent in its relief. Lydia and Garrett had endured the celebration, the questions, the apologies. They had accepted the handshakes and the free cups of coffee, but their silence, the true conversation, waited. By the next afternoon, the energy had subsided. A quiet, exhausted peace settled back over Red Willow. The sky, which had been a clear, sharp blue, softened to a high, veiled gray. A new wind, gentle and cold, began to move down from the peaks. It carried the scent of pine and the promise of a final, high country snow. They did not plan to meet. They were simply drawn, by the same invisible rope, to the place where everything had changed, the bank of Dry Creek. The water was lower now, no longer the brown, angry torrent of the flood. It was a clear, cold green, gurgling peacefully over the stones. The air was cold, and the ground was still damp from the melt. As they stood there, a few tiny, dry flakes of snow began to fall. Not a storm, but a dusting, like salt scattered on the dark earth. Lydia was wearing her old wool coat and her bonnet. The bonnet, the one she had snatched from the mud, was clean now, but the ribbons were still torn, tied in that hard, desperate knot. She stood looking at the water, at the place where the calf had been saved, where she had been dragged from the flood. She untied the knot. Her fingers, still calloused but no longer raw, worked the fabric loose. She pulled the bonnet from her head, letting the cold air, the gentle wind, touch her hair. She held the bonnet in her hand, letting the breeze dry the last of the dampness from the brim. Garrett watched her. He had been standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his posture as still as the rocks. He had spent 7 years of his life watching, not participating. He was done watching. He moved, closing the small distance between them. He did not come to stand in front of her, to face her. He came to stand with her. He settled just behind her.
so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. He was a solid wall, breaking the wind that she had just invited in. He took off his heavy sheepskin coat, the one he wore every day, the one that smelled of him, of leather and wood smoke and the cold, clean air of the basin. He did not ask. He simply draped it over her shoulders, over her own thin coat. The weight of it was immediate. It was heavy and warm, and it enveloped her. It was the most profound embrace she had ever known. She instinctively pulled the thick shearling lapels together, her hands clutching the coat that was his. They stood in silence for a long time. The only sounds were the moving water and the whisper of the salt snow touching the ground. "He is gone," Garrett said, his voice a low rumble, spoken just beside her ear. "Yes?" He took a deep breath. The next words were harder. "Lydia, when Maribel gave me the choice, the contracts," he stopped. "I left your cabin. I let you think. I let you stand alone. I rode to the ridge, and I watched them digging that ditch. I almost stayed there. I almost let them." "But you did not," she whispered, her hands tightening on his coat. "You rode down. You stood with me." "It took me too long," he said, his voice rough with self-condemnation. "I hesitated. I weighed your life against my ledger. That is not something a man should do." She tilted her head back slightly, her hair brushing the wool of his shirt. "You were trapped, Garrett. It is what men like Ames do. They trap people. I understood. I even told you to go. It is what I do. I push people away before they have the chance to leave on their own." He heard the admission in her voice, the truth of her own scarred past. "You expected me to fail you," he said. "I expected you to save yourself," she replied. "Everyone in Laramie saved themselves. I learned to see the exit. I am so very tired of running." He felt the tremor that ran through her. This was the fear, not of Ames, not of fire, but of this, of standing still. "I am not good at this. Lydia," he said, his own voice quiet. He looked over her head, at the creek, at the spot where he had almost lost her to the water. "I am not good at holding on. The last time I allowed myself to care for someone, I lost her." He swallowed, the memory a physical thing. "Sarah, she died on Chalk Ridge. She loved to ride too fast. I loved to watch her. I spent 7 years building a wall, a high one, to make sure I never had to feel that again." "And then you found me," Lydia said, her voice soft. "Building a wall of my own, with blistered hands." A small, sad smile touched his lips. "You were doing it all wrong. The bracing was terrible." She leaned her head back against his chest. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against her shoulder blades. It was the most solid, real thing she had ever felt. His hand, the one that had been resting on his side, moved. He did not reach for her waist or her shoulder. He reached for her hand, the one that was clutching his coat. His large, work-roughened fingers gently, slowly, uncurled her fist. He laid his palm over hers, his thumb moving, just once, over the hard-won calluses on her knuckles. Then his fingers slid, tracing a line, slow and warm, up the inside of her wrist. It was not a grasp. It was a question, a line of gentle fire, drawn on her cold skin. She did not pull away. She did not flinch. She simply let out a breath she felt she had been holding since she arrived in Wyoming. And she moved. She did not lean back further into him. She turned, slowly, inside the circle of his coat. She turned, never breaking his gaze, and took the small half-step forward that closed the last, fragile inch between them. She was standing inside his embrace, her hands still clutching his coat, his hands now resting lightly on her back. He looked down at her. This was not the creek bank. There was no desperation, no flood, no shock. This was the quiet. This was the choice. Her slate-gray eyes were clear, steady, and full of a terrifying, open vulnerability. He lowered his head. The second kiss was nothing like the first. The first had been a collision, born of ice and adrenaline. This was a decision, a testament. It was longer. It was surer. It was a slow, deep claiming. There was no desperation. There was only heat. His lips were not chapped and cold, but warm and certain. She tasted the coffee from his morning, the clean scent of the salt snow, and the quiet, solid strength that was uniquely him. Her hands, which had been clutching his coat, slid up. They moved over his chest, feeling the solid muscle, and locked behind his neck, her fingers tangling in the thick hair at his collar. His own hands, which had been resting respectfully on her back, tightened. He did not grab her. He gathered her closer. He supported her, one hand moving up to cradle the back of her head, holding her to him as if she were the anchor and he were the one in danger of being swept away. Their breath mingled, warm, visible clouds in the cooling air. The world outside them continued. The creek gurgled over the stones. The wind whispered through the bare willow branches. But in the space they occupied, there was only warmth and the slow, shared rhythm of breathing, and the profound, electric silence of two solitudes finally touching. When they broke, it was not a separation. It was a pause. They rested their foreheads together. Lydia's eyes were closed, her breath coming in a soft, unsteady sigh. She whispered, the words spoken against the wool of his shirt. "I want to stay." She pulled back just enough to look at him. I do not just mean the land, not for the creek. I mean, I want to stay for you." He looked at her, and the deep lines around his eyes, the lines of grief and 7 years of loneliness, softened. A slow, genuine smile, the one she had seen only a shadow of before, transformed his face. "Is that so?" he said, his voice rough with an emotion he had not allowed himself in years. He tipped her chin up with one finger, then rested his forehead against hers again. "Well, that is a problem." "A problem," she whispered. "The kitchen in that cabin of yours is barely big enough for one. The stove is too small." He smiled, his eyes holding hers. "If you are staying, then I'm going to have to build the kitchen twice as big." It was not a poem. It was not a flowery vow. It was a promise, spoken in the language of timber and nails, of shared meals and long winters. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. A small sound, half laugh, half sob, escaped her. In that moment, her hand, the one that had been holding her bonnet, went slack. The bonnet, her old armor, her last piece of a life she had left behind, slipped from her grasp. It fell, silently, onto the damp grass at the edge of the creek bank. Neither of them moved to retrieve it. Lydia looked at it, lying there, a simple, discarded thing. Then she looked back up at Garrett. She had let it fall. She was no longer the woman who ran. She was home. He saw the decision in her eyes. He smiled and kissed her again, sealing the promise as the first true flakes of winter began to fall around them. Percival Ames was not a man who accepted defeat. He was a creature of leverage, and in the small, dark jail cell, awaiting the arrival of the territorial escort, he found his last, desperate peace. The deputy Judge Reed had left guarding the cell was a young man with a weak chin and greedy eyes. Ames, his hands clasped on his silver-headed cane, spoke of a lost gold watch, a reward of $500, if it could be found. The watch, he implied, was in the possession of 3 men, the Rourke brothers, who frequented the saloon's back room. The bribe was clumsy, but the deputy was weak. The message was delivered. Ames's plan was no longer about the law. It was about pure, spiteful revenge. He could not have the water. He could not have the land. He could not have the woman. But he could destroy what she had built. He could break her spirit by breaking her work. The Rourke brothers were hired not to kill, but to maim the land itself, to dynamite the small headgate and the diversion dam Lydia and Garrett had reinforced, to burn what was left of her cabin. A final lesson. Sent from a cell. Elijah Pike, however, had not gone to bed. He was a man who understood the arrogance of men like Ames. He sat in the darkened saloon, sipping a cold coffee, his quiet eyes watching the deputy, watching the jail, watching the Rourkes leave the back room. He saw them ride out of town, their saddlebags heavy, their direction clear. Pike did not alert the town. He went straight to the quarter moon. The ranch house was dark, save for the low light in the kitchen. Garrett, Lydia, and Tobin Sutter were mapping out the spring planting for Lydia's property. Pike entered without knocking. "He is making a move. 3 men, the Rourkes, riding for the creek. They are armed, and they are carrying blasting powder." Garrett was on his feet instantly. He did not ask questions. He grabbed his rifle from the rack. "Tobin, the horses!" "Lydia," Garrett said, turning to her. "Stay here. Bolt the door." "No," she said. She was already pulling on her coat, his coat, which she had not taken off. "I am not hiding while you fight for my land. That dam has a weakness. The old spillway. If they set a charge, I know how to release the pressure." He looked at her, saw the steel in her eyes. It was the same steel he had seen when she faced the town. He nodded once. "Then let's ride." The night was cold and sharp, the moon a bright, hard coin that threw the basin into stark relief of silver and black. They did not ride as a mob. They rode as a team. Garrett and Tobin took the narrow game trail, a choke point in the canyon that the Rourkes would have to pass through. Elijah Pike, moving like a ghost, climbed the high ridge above the pass, his long-range rifle resting easily in his arms. Lydia rode with Nora Dunn, who had been summoned by Pike and carried a heavy canvas bag. They rode straight to the creek, to the high ground above the headgate. They were the defense. The Rourke brothers rode hard, eager for Ames's gold. They entered the narrow pass, the canyon walls rising steeply on both sides, their horses' hooves clicking on the rock. The leader reined in. "Smells wrong," he muttered. A sound, a sharp hiss, came from the ridge above them. Whoosh! The canyon was lit, not by the moon, but by a blinding, terrible magnesium-white light. Nora Dunn had lit a railroad flare. It burned with a sputtering, white-hot intensity, turning the night into a brilliant, terrifying day, robbing the gunmen of their shadows and their night vision. The horses screamed, rearing in panic. The Rourkes, blinded, grabbed for their reins. "Rourke!" Garrett's voice boomed from the darkness in front of them, the sound echoing off the rock. "You are covered. Throw down your rifles." "The hell I will," the leader shouted. Pulling his horse down, he fumbled for his pistol, firing blindly toward the voice. The bullet sparked off the rock, 10 feet wide. Crack! A different sound, a high-velocity rifle shot, not from Garrett. From above. The bullet struck the rock just inches from the gunman's head, sending a spray of granite chips into his face. "The next one." Elijah Pike's dry, calm voice drifted down from the ridge. "Will not be a warning. You are interfering with a federal marshal's investigation. Drop your weapons. Now." Trapped, blinded by the flare. Blocked by Garrett, and targeted by Pike. 2 of the brothers immediately threw their guns to the ground. But the leader, the one paid the most, was desperate. He saw one path, a narrow deer trail that bypassed the blockade. He spurred his horse, crashing through the brush, breaking for the creek. He had a torch, already lit, and a stick of dynamite. "I'll take the dam," he screamed. "I'll finish the job." He burst through the willows and onto the creek bank. He saw Lydia, standing alone by the heavy wooden lever of the spillway. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He lit the long fuse on the dynamite and spurred his horse forward. Torch held high, he would throw the charge at the dam and the torch at the woman. Lydia did not run. She waited, She watched him coming, the fuse sputtering. "Now," she whispered. She grabbed the massive wooden lever of the emergency spillway and, with a grunt of exertion, threw her entire body weight against it. There was a deep, groaning sound of ancient, waterlogged timbers shifting. The spillway gate, which had been sealed for a decade, tore open. It was not a flood. It was a focused, controlled torrent. A solid, 6-foot wall of icy creek water, diverted from the main channel, shot out of the spillway and poured directly onto the trail. The gunman's horse, running at a full gallop, hit the sudden river and went down as if poleaxed. The rider flew from the saddle. The lit torch vanished under the water with a loud, final hiss. The stick of dynamite, its fuse sputtering, landed in the churning water and was swept away. Harmless. The gunman landed hard. The air knocked from his lungs. The flare died. The canyon was plunged back into darkness. The only sounds the gurgling of the diverted water and the groans of the fallen man. Headlights appeared. Tobin Sutter, now wearing the deputy's star Judge Reed had given him, rode in with a dozen ranchers, alerted by the flare in the shot. They rounded up the 2 disarmed gunmen in the pass. They found the third, soaked and sputtering, and pulled him from the mud. The ambush was over. Percival Ames, from his cell, had heard the flare. He had heard the single, echoing shot. He knew, with a sick certainty, that he had failed. In a blind panic, he shoved the young deputy aside and bolted. He ran from the jail, a free man for only a moment, his silver-headed cane forgotten. He ran, not toward the road, but away from the town, scrambling through the darkness, his only thought to hide. He burst onto the bank of Dry Creek, his lungs burning, his city shoes slick with mud. He ran straight into the center of the aftermath. He saw the ranchers, Tobin with his badge, and the 3 Rourke brothers, their hands bound. He saw Pike, calmly reloading his rifle. He saw Garrett Holloway standing beside Lydia. Ames froze. He was surrounded. He tried to turn, to flee back into the darkness. He slipped. His expensive leather-soled shoe found no purchase on a single, wet, algae-covered stone at the water's edge. His arms pinwheeled. A ridiculous, frantic gesture in the moonlight. He let out a high, thin wail, and he fell. He did not fall into the water. He fell face first, with a thick, wet, obscene splat into the deep, black, sucking mud of the creek bank. He lay there for a moment, stunned. Then he tried to push himself up. He was covered. The mud, the earth he had tried to steal, was in his mouth, on his silk cravat, matting his hair. He was a creature of filth. Tobin Sutter walked over, looked down at the ruined man, and placed a heavy, unimpressed hand on his shoulder. "It's over, Mr. Ames. You are done in this territory." The next morning, Ada Whitcomb formally handed her entire file, the affidavits, the rubbings, the photographic plates, and Nora's forged steel die to Judge Reed as he boarded the stage. His prisoners, Ames and Kettering, chained in the wagon behind. As the stage rolled out of town, a sound began. It was the church bell. Reverend Cole was ringing it, not for a wedding, not for a service, but as a clear, bright proclamation of justice, a sound of liberation that rolled across the entire basin. That night, the basin was quiet. The air was cold, the ground sparkling with the salt snow that had fallen. Garrett walked back to Lydia, who was still standing by the creek, her hand on the lever that had saved her home. The ranchers were gone. The fight was over. Garrett stood in front of her. He was covered in mud. She was soaked. He looked at her, at the quiet, unshakable strength that had beaten an entire conspiracy. He said nothing. He just held out his hand. She looked at his gloved, muddy hand. Then she placed her own in it, their fingers interlaced. A silent, binding contract of equals. A partnership forged in fire, flood, and steel. He drew her close. The air was sharp, biting at their skin. Lydia was breathing hard, the adrenaline of the night just beginning to fade.
leaving her shaken. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. A kiss of profound, exhausted relief. It was slow and deep and tasted of the cold night air, the mineral scent of the creek, and the salty trace of the mist on her lips. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her breath a white cloud between them. She whispered, her voice rough. We kept the water. She put her free hand on his chest, feeling the solid beat of his heart. And we kept each other. Garrett held her, his grip unbreakable. He looked past her, into the darkness. On the muddy bank, just at the edge of the lapping water, her bonnet lay where it had fallen, the one she had let go. A cold gust of wind, the same wind that had tried to tear her from this land, came down the canyon. It lifted the brim of the bonnet, making the torn ribbons flutter, as if waving a small, final goodbye. In the background, two figures, Lydia and Garrett, stood as one, locked in a breathless kiss as the first real snow of winter began to fall. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please leave a comment and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give us your support by hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.